After doing a long stretch of island topics, doesn't it make most sense to go deep into the Central Asian deserts? Turkmenistan really seems to be getting a lot of attention from niche geography YouTubers these days. And that's cool and all if you're fine with it being dumbed down to ha ha ha, look at this big marble place with literally 0 people. I'm being very objective and not clickbaity. Woo! Nah, we can do better than that. And instead of focusing on 5 cities like we did in the last video, we're going to zoom right into the capital, because there's obviously a lot to talk about here. The capital's name is Ashgabat, and there are actually over 1 million people living there. So similar to the last video, we're going to mostly center around the physical location itself, then a little bit of the history, and then some things worth seeing. I was going to try to break it down by districts, but then I decided, it's too much work. Last thing I need is somebody telling me that I'm wrong about where something is in which district. So let's get into it. For those unaware, Turkmenistan itself is in Central Asia, sandwiched primarily between Iran and Uzbekistan. However, there are also borders with Afghanistan and Kazakhstan, with the Caspian Sea making up its entire western border. With that said, Ashgabat specifically is in the southern central region of the country, only about 30 kilometers from the border with Iran, depending on which part of Iran and the city that you start and end with. Now, the whole country is divided up into 5 regions, but the capital kind of works as its own, similar to Washington, D.C. in relation to the 50 U.S. states. Ashgabat is thus an enclave of the Ahal region, situated between what is known as the Karakum Desert and the Kopet Dag mountain range, which makes up much of the nation's border with Iran. These mountains run from the Caspian Sea for about 645 kilometers, and the highest mountain within this range proper is Kukukin, falling on the Iranian side at about 3,190 meters. They're made of carbonate and clastic rock, and anywhere from 23 to 66 million years ago, the Arabian plate crashed into the Eurasian plate, which continues to shape the range to this day. Naturally, this creates a region that's extremely seismic, and you'll find that this has kind of played a role in the country's turbulent history more than once. Since the city is located on the foothills, it's primarily going to experience desert vegetation. However, as you go up the mountain range, you'll find grasslands that can tolerate drought, and at the top you'll even find some cypress forests. Climate-wise, the capital is described as having a Mediterranean-adjacent type feel to it, with the summers being warm and dry and winters being cold and wet. It's also sometimes simply described as a colder desert, and that's mostly because winters get very cold, however they're kind of short-lived. And it shouldn't be much of a surprise that rivers aren't really abundant here. There is, however, the Karakum Canal that was built during the Soviet era, which runs through the city, getting its source from the Amudarya. That's basically a really long river running across Central Asia and forms a large part of the border with Uzbekistan. As I said more than once, Ashgabat has been subject to some very turbulent history, so we're going to take some time to dive deeper into that. Now, it didn't actually exist in its modern form until the later 19th century, however, historically it can go back around 2,300 years. It would start out as a small town called Kanjikala in what was known as the Parthian Empire, a power centered in ancient Iran from 247 BC until 224 AD. That empire actually stretched all the way from the Mediterranean over to like India and China. The town was very much known for its really nice wines, but unfortunately it would be subject to a very vicious earthquake in the 1st century BC. And that wouldn't be the last time. So something you should know is that Turkmens were originally a very nomadic people group. Therefore, they didn't see a whole lot of significance in establishing like really rooted down towns where they're going to just stay put for a while, but it would still remain significant enough as a stop along the Silk Road. Now, over the next millennium, Arabs would slowly take over, and then the later part of that, they would introduce Islam to the region, but before that, it was primarily made up of people who followed Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, till it came under the Turkic Seljuk control. And after that, while this isn't a natural disaster, the Mongols would come in and completely ransack the town. They pretty much massacred everybody in the entire city, obliterating so much of it which a lot of Central Asia in the time felt that same fate. This nomadic region in particular would mostly stay under the control of the Ilk Khanate for much of the Mongol rule, and because of this, the next couple centuries would see all sorts of different groupings coming and going, which would further cement a more Turkmen identity. A poet by the name of Magtimgali Piragi would further cement this by calling for the unity between different Turkmen tribes, which is probably about when signs of the modern state began. Now, this isn't really specific to Ashgabat only, but I felt it was worth mentioning because obviously this region still had a lot of influence from the Arabs and the Persians. So, the Teak Turkmen tribe would control it as a bit of a Persian protectorate until the Russians defeated them in the Battle of the Göek Tepe in 1881. This would pretty much see completion of the Russians' conquering of Central Asia under what was known as the Akhal Treaty. They would then build a fortress using the name Ashgabat, and by 1885 the Trans-Persian Railway reached it, boosting trade between the British allied Persia and the Russian Empire. So understandably, the early 20th century saw a lot of European-style buildings, and considering it was a Russian garrison city, a lot of the streets were named after Russian military figures like Mikhail Skobelov. Enter the Russian Revolution of 1917. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks fought over Ashgabat during the following civil war, but by 1919 it was fully run by what was known as the Tashkent Soviet. The name was briefly changed to Poltoratsk after the current chairman, and the modern country's borders that we still see to this day came to life from Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin around 1924 as the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic. The capital would get its proper Ashgabat name back in 1927, and like most communist nations, big streets and squares would take after names of famous communist figures such as Karl Marx. During World War II, Ashgabat actually served as a place of refuge for people who were living on the Western Front, namely Ukrainians and of course a lot of university students, and in 1944 the film Rainbow was actually shot here. Unfortunately, after the victory of World War II, the city would be leveled again by another extremely massive earthquake. It killed about 2/3 of the population of the city. Rebuilding that would see the Eastern Bloc style architecture emerge that rapidly grew throughout all the socialist world, industrializing heavily up until independence in 1991. And right about here is where we start to see the beginning of what people think about when they think of Ashgabat today. The marble buildings and all the marble monuments and the street names that used serial numbers for a time would appear. It would start to break some serious world records in the Guinness Book, such as having the world's highest concentration of white marble buildings in 2013. The first independence leader, Niyazov, had a very big cult following, very much a cult of personality, and when he died, some things were actually changed back to certain Soviet-style things, although not entirely. It's kind of confusing. But they definitely put more emphasis on like Turkmen poets and heroes. And if I keep going here, I'm going to start talking about the sites anyway, so let's move on to the sites. Before we start this next part, I'm going to address an elephant in the room. Nick, if there are over 1 million people living here, how come none of the videos ever have people in them when people travel here? Well, friends, it's because most of those videos take place in the richer, touristy areas that most common people don't have a reason or really an affordability to go to anyway. And that's literally just this spot here, as if this entire bulk of the city over here doesn't exist. Why would we ever go over there, right? Holy crap! Cars! I had no idea. Even though that still means little because who knows when this was taken. Guys, stop. Also, Turkmen government, if you're watching this, I would love an invitation to come see your country. Alright, out of the way. So after the devastating earthquake in the late 40s, the Soviet authorities divided it up into 4 main boroughs, and much of what we just kind of talked about is in the Buzhmayan borough. This actually extended the city's borders about 15% further. This is where you'll find that famous Ferris wheel, being the largest indoor one in the world, at a place known as the Alam Cultural and Entertainment Center. You'll notice the stone star of Oguz Khan, which appears on a lot of architecture and monuments in Ashgabat, and probably Turkmenistan as a whole. The diameter is 57 meters, and it hit the Guinness Book of World Records in 2012. Another iconic thing that has this is the Turkmenistan TV Tower, which is actually just outside of the limits in the Kopadag slopes. It's got 31 floors and a round restaurant at the top to give a good view of the city and the mountains. Next, we'll hop over to Baj Kochki Palace. It's a massive globe that's surrounded by these same stars, housing a wedding hall and a 10-story basement with shops and rooms. Right near this also sits the Ashgabat Stadium that holds around 20,000 people, primarily for football matches and celebrations. Oh, there's a big old golden monument outside of this too. There's all the beautiful marble buildings behind it, which I guess could lead us to the emphasis on the white marble itself. This hit the world record books in 2013, dating back to the start of the century, along with all the golden statues such as the Turkmen horses and the one that we just looked at. A fountain complex made up of over 26 fountains is a massive monument dedicated also to Oguz Khan. And another horse-related site is the giant head found on the Olympic Stadium. Independence Park is also full of these types of things. Same with the National Library and the Presidential Palace, the Neutrality Arch, and even the International Airport. And you'll find that most of the cars are white. And no, you're not going to get arrested for driving a car that isn't white. It's kind of a more cultural thing, and it might be frowned upon if you don't at least keep it clean. Actually, that might be a law, but I can't imagine it's as strict as we're told. Actually, all the taxis are yellow, just like in most of the world. As strange as some of this might seem, again, it's kind of just because not a lot of people have a reason to travel to these parts. But I don't want to focus too much on the myths, because that's not what we're here for. However, it is worth mentioning that most police are friendly and personable and will help you if you need it. It's very safe at night. And despite being an Islamic nation, you can find alcohol if you want. Western music also is not unheard of, and women are not forced to cover up. It's just something a lot of people choose to do. And for crying out loud, no, this is not saying that everything there is perfect or great or anything. I'm just kind of trying to, cover all my bases here. So let's transition into the less talked about parts of Ashgabat. That being, all that other stuff. Moving inward to something called Inspiration Park, this is also a recent building that has a little more foot traffic and cars, as well as evidence of older Soviet architecture. The streets are still relatively wide, and there are educational institutions, a museum, and residential areas that surround it. Looking a little off to the side of that are buildings that are green and blue, contrary to what people might think of, and this is mostly going to house state migration services. Oh, and fun fact, Turkmen citizens can actually visit Turkey visa-free. There's actually a Turkmen-Turkish friendship park by the city limits. Ironically, you can also see a lot of the Soviet architecture right outside of Independence Park, which you'll come across schools, a library, tennis courts, and the likes. Now, you may have seen that famous massive book known as the Renumat, or the Book of the Soul in English. This is that two-parter written by the first leader, Sapar Murat Niyazov, apparently meant to further emphasize the importance on the Turkmen character. This is also close to the International Oil and Gas University. Now, as I mentioned that it's an Islamic country, it should be no surprise that there are a handful of beautiful mosques. The Hazra Omar Mosque is one of them, and its lights give it a very interesting look at night. Deeper into the city sits the Ertuğrul Gazi Mosque, standing out with its 4 minarets and central dome, very reflective of the Ottoman style. The Jimin sculpture somewhat looks like a bright jewel in the midst of what otherwise feels like a typical Eastern European setting, although obviously we are not in Europe. And similar to the likes of Disneyland, there is the World of the Turkmenbashi Tales. This actually opened in 2006 and is apparently a very popular concert spot. Right by this park you can actually find some Russian Orthodox churches. Those do still exist here. Going back to 1994, there's the Turkmen Carpet Museum, which houses the largest collection of carpets made by Turkmenbashi in the world. And given the quilted look on the flag, I imagine that these hold a pretty heavy significance for their culture. Matter of fact, you can even find the world's largest carpet. And by the way, there actually is a US embassy here too, and it's not too far from Lenin Park, being one of the odes to the Soviet era. You will find more of Lenin around here than you'd think, and a short distance from this one is the Soviet Sheik, with the former Communist Party archives and some fantastic brutalism. And believe it or not, bars and pubs are still found all over the place. One such as the Sarai Pub, the Burke Garden Pub, Diamond Pub, and the Royal Bar, the British-themed pub. And these are mostly in this downtown area we've been talking about. It's more foot traffic, and honestly it took like no digging to find them. Like literally, I just looked up pubs and bars in Ashgabat. A particularly busy spot is at the Al-Tinister Bazaar, one of the largest markets in Central Asia, in a residential area known as Chogonli. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of stalls have food and items like clothing, jewelry, animals, and of course, carpets. Apparently the entire layout actually kind of reflects the Turkmen carpet. Further east you'll find more residential areas, probably spots that have less of a draw for tourism, but again, this only further emphasizes the fact that the capital is more than just those large, white, seemingly empty areas. There's even a state racetrack way out there, primarily for horses, and I guess I should note that the special Akal Teak horse is only found in Turkmenistan, one with a very unique fur color that makes them look a little shiny. And just like anywhere, there are schools, parks, hospitals, playgrounds, sports centers, gyms, and basically anything that any society would need to carry out its normal day-to-day functions. And I think we're going to conclude right there. And at the end of the day, Ashgabat may seem like a bit of a strange place, but it really isn't that different than a lot of other places. Obviously, some laws and governmental practices are a little different than what we're familiar with here in the Western world, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the way you think it is. It's been through a lot. Despite how ancient it is, it was built and destroyed by earthquakes, and built again and destroyed by the Mongols, and built again and ravished by wars, and destroyed by another earthquake, and rebuilt by the Soviets. And by the end of the 90s, it started being covered in marble by these touristy spots. Despite all this change, there are all sorts of remnants of Russian and Persian and Arab flavors. A place I'd absolutely love to visit in my lifetime. As always, thank you for sticking around with me till the very end. This was a very fun video to do the research, which as usual you can find in the description. And until we meet again, comrades.